The scissors were still in my hand when the last lock of her hair hit the floor. I stood there in the marble hallway of the house, breathing hard, watching dark curls settle around her feet like something dying. Her name was Grace. She had worked in this house for almost a year, folding towels, carrying trays, smiling at guests who never noticed her. I had noticed her. I had noticed the way my fiancé's eyes lingered on her a second too long during breakfast, the way he thanked her too warmly when she brought him coffee, the way his voice softened just slightly whenever she was in the room. So when I heard the whispers among the other staff, the ones who thought I couldn't hear them, whispers about late-night conversations in the study and closed doors that stayed closed a little too long, something in me snapped. I told myself I was protecting what was mine. I told myself this was fair. Grace did not scream. She did not cry. She did not even flinch when the blades came close to her scalp. She simply knelt there, perfectly still, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on some point past my shoulder, as if I were not even worth looking at directly. When I finished, she reached up once, touched the uneven ends of what remained of her hair, and then stood without a word. "You will not speak of this to anyone," I said, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to. "Do you understand me?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, and what I saw in her eyes was not fear. It was something closer to pity, and that frightened me more than anger ever could have. "I understand you completely," she said quietly, "more than you understand yourself." Then she turned and walked down the hallway, her shoulders straight, her steps unhurried, leaving me standing alone with a pair of scissors and a growing feeling that I had just made a terrible mistake. My name is Charlotte Hale, and in 3 weeks I was supposed to become the wife of Damien Voss, a man whose family controlled half the shipping routes on the eastern coast, and whose name alone could empty a room. I had met him at a charity gala 18 months ago, and from the moment his eyes found mine across that crowded ballroom, I believed my life had changed for the better. He was powerful, controlled, and utterly unreadable to everyone except, it seemed, the people who had known him the longest. I had spent the last year and a half trying to become one of those people. I was not there yet, not completely, and some nights, that gap between us felt wider than the ocean his ships crossed. I walked back to my room that evening, with my heart still pounding, replaying the scene over and over, trying to convince myself that jealousy was a reasonable excuse for what I had done. I told myself Grace would say nothing, that the staff feared me enough to keep quiet, that by morning this would be forgotten like 100 small cruelties before it. I was wrong about all of it. I sat at my vanity for a long while after that, staring at my own reflection, trying to understand the woman looking back at me. I had grown up in a modest house 2 towns over, the daughter of a school teacher and an accountant, raised on the belief that kindness cost nothing, and cruelty always found its way back to you eventually. I had never once, in 26 years of living, hurt another person the way I had hurt Grace that afternoon. Yet standing over her with those scissors, I had felt something almost like relief, as if cutting away her hair might also cut away the doubt that had been eating at me for weeks. Now, sitting alone with my reflection, that relief had curdled into something closer to shame, though I was still too proud to call it by its true name. I told myself again that Damien would never choose a maid over the woman he had proposed to in front of 300 guests. I told myself the whispers among the staff meant nothing, that servants always gossiped about the people who held power over them, twisting small kindnesses into scandal, simply because they had little else to talk about. I repeated these thoughts until they almost felt true, and then I changed for dinner, and went downstairs, to prove to myself that nothing had changed. Dinner that night was unbearable. Damien sat across from me at the long table, cutting into his food with the same precise, unhurried movements he used for everything, his dark eyes occasionally flicking toward the door as if expecting someone. He did not mention Grace. He did not mention anything unusual at all. He asked about the wedding florist, about my sister's flight arrangements for the ceremony, about whether I had chosen a final design for my dress. His voice was calm, pleasant even, and that calm terrified me more than any accusation would have. Halfway through the meal, one of the older housekeepers, a stern woman named Margaret, who had worked for the Voss family for over 20 years, entered the room to clear the plates. Her eyes met mine for just a moment, and in that moment, I saw something I had never seen from her before. Not disapproval, not judgment, something closer to fear, aimed not at me, but for me. I lost my appetite completely after that. Later, lying awake in my bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door, soft and unhurried, moving toward Damien's study at the far end of the house. I recognized the rhythm of that walk. It was Grace. I told myself it meant nothing. Staff had reasons to visit the study at odd hours, papers to deliver, messages to pass along, but something about the timing, so soon after what I had done to her, made my stomach tighten with a dread I could not name. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, staying close to the wall the way I had seen in old films, feeling foolish and desperate at the same time. The study door was slightly open, a sliver of golden lamplight spilling onto the dark wood floor. I pressed myself against the wall beside it and listened. "She had no right," Damien's voice said, low and controlled, the same voice he used when discussing business deals worth millions. "But you know how this must be handled." "I know," Grace answered, her voice steady, almost gentle. "I am not angry, Damien. I never wanted anger from you." The sound of my fiancé's first name, spoken so easily, so intimately, from the mouth of a maid I had humiliated hours earlier, hit me like a slap. Damien did not correct her. He did not scold her for the familiarity. He simply exhaled, a long, tired breath that I had never once heard him make in front of me. "It changes things," he said. "You understand that it changes things now." "I understand," Grace said. "I have always understood more than you think I do." I could not listen to another word. I turned and walked quickly back to my room, my hands trembling, my mind racing through every possible explanation and rejecting each one before it fully formed. Was she his mistress? Was she something else entirely, something I had not even considered? The way they spoke to each other held no trace of an employer addressing an employee. It held history. It held weight. I did not sleep that night. I lay staring at the ceiling, turning the sound of her voice over and over in my mind, searching for some clue I had missed. In the morning, I decided I would confront Damien directly, demand to know exactly who Grace was, and why cutting her hair had apparently changed something between them that I could not begin to understand. But when I came down for breakfast, Grace was gone. Not fired. Not sent away in disgrace as I had expected. Simply gone, her small room at the back of the house cleared out overnight, as if she had never existed at all. When I asked Margaret where she had gone, the older woman's face went pale, and she excused herself from the room without answering. I found Damien in his study an hour later, standing at the window with his back to me, his hands clasped behind him in the posture he used when negotiating something he did not want to negotiate. "Where is she?" I asked. He did not turn around immediately. When he finally did, his expression was calm, but his eyes were colder than I had ever seen them, colder than the day we first met, colder than any business rival he had ever described crushing without mercy. "You should not have touched her," he said simply. "She is a maid, Damien. I am your fiancé." He studied me for a long moment, and in that silence, I felt something shift permanently between us, some fragile trust I had spent 18 months building, now cracking beneath a weight I did not yet understand. "There are things about this house you do not know," he said finally. "Things about my family, about debts older than either of us, about people who are never quite what they appear to be. Grace was one of those things." "Then tell me," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "Tell me who she really is." Damien walked past me toward the door, pausing only long enough to say 5 words that would haunt me for the rest of that week. "You will find out soon." He left the room without another glance, and I stood alone in his study, surrounded by shelves of books I had never read, and photographs of a family I suddenly realized I knew almost nothing about. My eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the far shelf I had never paid attention to before, an old picture showing a much younger Damien, standing beside his late mother, and beside them both, unmistakably, a young girl with the same calm, steady eyes I had looked into the night before while holding a pair of scissors. My hands went cold. Whoever Grace truly was, she had been part of this family's story long before I ever arrived, and somewhere deep in my chest, a quiet, sinking certainty began to grow that I had just cut far more than hair. I had cut into something old, something protected, something that powerful men like Damien Voss did not forgive easily. And for the first time since accepting his proposal, I felt truly and completely afraid of what I had gotten myself into. I thought about calling my sister, about packing a bag and driving home to the small house where I had grown up, where nothing more dangerous than a strict curfew had ever waited for me. But something kept me rooted in that study, staring at the photograph of a girl who was clearly Grace, standing beside a family that was not supposed to be hers. Leaving now would mean admitting I had done something unforgivable, and running from the consequences instead of facing them. Some stubborn, foolish part of me still believed I could fix this, that if I simply understood who Grace really was, I could find a way to undo the damage, before it consumed everything I had worked so hard to build with Damien. I did not yet know how wrong that belief would prove to be, or how quickly the walls of that house, once so unfamiliar and impressive to me, would begin to feel like the walls of a cage closing slowly around a woman who had made an enemy she never saw coming. 3 days passed, and no one spoke Grace's name inside that house. It was as though she had been erased on purpose, wiped from every conversation, every schedule, every corner she used to occupy. I asked Margaret again where Grace had gone, and this time, the older woman simply shook her head and walked faster, her keys jingling against her apron, as she disappeared down the service stairs. I asked one of the younger maids, a nervous girl named Poppy, who had always been kind to me, and she went pale and mumbled something about needing to finish the laundry before hurrying away without meeting my eyes. The silence around me was heavier than any accusation could have been. I had grown used to being watched in that house, the quiet attention of staff who knew their places and kept careful distance from the woman who would soon be their mistress. But this was different. This was avoidance. People who once nodded politely when I passed now found reasons to be somewhere else entirely. Doors that used to stay open now closed quietly the moment I approached. Damien was no better. He left early each morning before I woke, and returned late each night, long after I had given up waiting for him at dinner. When I did catch him, brief and hurried between meetings, his answers were short, and his patience thinner than I had ever known it to be. I asked him again who Grace was to him, and he simply repeated the same maddening words. "You will find out soon enough." I began to feel like a stranger in the house I was supposed to call home in a matter of weeks. I wandered the long hallways during the empty afternoons, studying photographs I had walked past 100 times, without truly looking at them. There were pictures of Damien as a boy, standing beside a stern-looking man I recognized as his father, the previous head of the family, a man who had died 5 years earlier, under circumstances no one in that house liked to discuss. There were photographs of galas and business gatherings, men in dark suits shaking hands with expressions that gave away nothing. And then, tucked at the very back of the study, behind a row of leather-bound books that looked as though they had not been touched in years, I found a small wooden box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied together with faded ribbon, the paper yellowed with age. Most were addressed to Damien's late mother, written in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the box and walked away, and pretended I had never seen it. But something about the desperation of my situation pushed me past every reasonable boundary I might otherwise have respected, and I began to read. The letters were from a man named Harold Ashby, a name I had never heard spoken in that house. He wrote about loyalty, about a debt he owed the Voss family that could never truly be repaid, about a night, many years earlier, when he had pulled a much younger Damien's father from a burning warehouse moments before the roof collapsed, at the cost of his own health and most of the strength in his right arm. He wrote about his daughter, a girl he hoped would grow up strong and steady, despite the hardship their family had faced since that night. He wrote her name only once, near the bottom of the final letter, in careful, deliberate handwriting. Grace. My breath caught in my throat. I read the sentence again, certain I had misunderstood, but there it was, unmistakable. Grace was not simply a maid who had caught my fiancé's attention. She was the daughter of the man who had saved his father's life, a man the entire Voss family apparently owed a debt too enormous to ever fully settle. And I had taken scissors to her hair as though she were nothing more than staff to be punished on a whim. I sat on the floor of that study for a long time, the letters scattered around me, trying to understand the full weight of what I had done. In a family like this, where loyalty was currency, and old debts were treated with the seriousness of sacred vows, my act of jealousy had not simply embarrassed a servant. It had insulted a woman whose family had quite literally saved theirs, a woman who had likely been placed in that house under some quiet, unspoken arrangement, meant to honor a debt that could never fully be repaid in money alone. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and quickly gathered the letters back into their box, my hands shaking as I shoved it back behind the leather-bound volumes, exactly as I had found it. I stood just in time to see Margaret pass by the study door, glancing in at me with an expression I could not quite read, something between suspicion and pity. "Margaret," I said before I could stop myself, "please, tell me about Grace's family." The older woman paused in the doorway, her hands folded in front of her apron, and for a long moment, I thought she would simply walk away like everyone else had. But something in my voice must have convinced her that I already knew more than I was supposed to, because she finally sighed and stepped fully into the room, closing the door quietly behind her. "Her father saved Mr. Voss's father's life," Margaret said, her voice low. "Everyone in this house knows the story, even if no one speaks it aloud. Grace grew up not far from here, and when her father passed 2 years ago, Damien brought her into this household himself. He said it was the least the family could do to repay a debt that could never truly be settled." "Why didn't anyone tell me this?" I asked. Margaret studied me for a long moment before answering. "Because some debts are not meant to be spoken about carelessly, Miss Hale, and because Mr. Voss did not believe you needed to know, given how things stood between you and Grace even before what happened 3 days ago." Her words landed like a blow, even before what happened 3 days ago, as if there had already been tension between Grace and me that I had somehow failed to notice, or perhaps had noticed and chosen to ignore, because acknowledging it would have meant admitting my own insecurity out loud. "What do you mean, even before?" I asked. Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the door as though checking for anyone who might overhear. "Mr. Voss has always treated Grace with a certain protectiveness, Miss Hale. Not the kind you might imagine between a man and a woman he desires, but the kind a man shows towards someone he considers family, someone he feels responsible for in ways that go beyond ordinary employment. I believe you sensed that protectiveness and mistook it for something else entirely." I sat down slowly in the chair behind Damien's desk, my mind racing to reconcile everything I thought I understood about my fiancé with this sudden, unwelcome complexity. If Margaret was telling the truth, then my jealousy had been misplaced from the very beginning, built on a misunderstanding I had refused to question, because questioning it would have meant confronting my own fear of not being enough for a man like Damien Voss. "Where is she now?" I asked quietly. "Where did he send her?" Margaret's expression grew guarded again, and I could see her weighing how much more she was willing to say. "That is not something I am able to tell you," she said finally. "But I will say this, Miss Hale, because I believe someone should. What you did to that girl was cruel, and cruelty in this family does not go unanswered, no matter who commits it. I would prepare myself, if I were you, for whatever comes next." She left the room before I could ask anything further, her footsteps fading down the hallway, with the same unhurried certainty I had noticed in Grace on the night I cut her hair. I sat alone in that study for a long time afterward, staring at the shelves of books that suddenly felt like they belonged to a family history far more dangerous and complicated than I had ever imagined when I accepted Damien's proposal. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed, replaying every interaction I had witnessed between Damien and Grace over the past year, searching for evidence of the protectiveness Margaret had described, rather than the romantic intimacy I had convinced myself I was seeing. The warm thank you when she brought his coffee, the lingering glance during breakfast, the late-night conversations in the study. Viewed through this new understanding, they all suddenly seemed to fit a different pattern entirely, one built on gratitude and old family duty rather than desire. But knowing this now did nothing to undo what I had already done. Grace was gone, sent away to some unknown location, her hair cut short by my own hand, out of a jealousy that had never been justified in the first place. And somewhere out there, decisions were being made about what consequence I would face for that mistake, decisions I had no part in, and no power to influence. The following morning, I found Poppy alone in the linen room, folding towels with quick, nervous movements. She startled when she saw me standing in the doorway, nearly dropping the stack in her arms. "Please," I said, keeping my voice as gentle as I could manage. "I only want to talk. No one else needs to know." Poppy glanced past me toward the hallway, clearly checking for anyone who might overhear, before finally setting down the towels and facing me fully. "You should not be asking me these things, Miss Hale. It is not my place." "I know," I said. "But you have always been kind to me, Poppy, and I do not have anyone else I can ask. Please, what do the other staff say about what happened?" She hesitated for a long moment, twisting the hem of her apron between her fingers. "They say you did not understand what you were doing," she said finally. "They say if you had known who Grace truly was, you never would have touched her. But they also say that ignorance does not undo harm, Miss Hale. My grandmother always told me that. Not knowing why a wound was caused does not make it hurt any less to the person bleeding." Her words settled over me like a weight pressing down on my chest. I thanked her quietly and left the linen room, understanding that even the staff who felt sympathy for my situation could not excuse what I had done. Ignorance, however honest, was not innocence. I had acted out of jealousy and insecurity, without pausing to ask a single question about the woman I was hurting, and now, I would have to live with whatever consequences followed from that failure. I spent the rest of that day wandering the grounds outside the house, trying to clear my head among the gardens Damien's mother had once tended with her own hands, according to Margaret. The roses were in full bloom, deep red and heavy with the weight of summer, and for a strange moment, I found myself thinking about Grace, kneeling in the hallway, with the same stillness these flowers seemed to hold, patient and unshaken, even as I cut away something that had clearly meant more to her family's dignity than I had ever bothered to understand. I tried calling my sister that evening, needing to hear a voice from my life before all of this, someone who could remind me of who I had been before jealousy and fear had turned me into a woman capable of the cruelty I had shown in that hallway. She answered cheerfully, asking about wedding preparations, about dress fittings and seating arrangements, completely unaware of the storm quietly gathering around me. I could not bring myself to tell her the truth. I simply said, everything was fine, and hung up feeling more alone than I had in years. That night, I dreamed of scissors and dark curls falling like rain, and of a pair of steady, unafraid eyes watching me from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light. 2 days later, a car arrived at the house that I did not recognize, sleek and black, with tinted windows that gave nothing away. I watched from my bedroom window as 2 men stepped out, dressed in dark suits, their posture rigid and formal, in a way that immediately set my nerves on edge. Damien came out to greet them personally, something he rarely did for ordinary visitors, and the 3 of them spoke quietly on the front steps, before disappearing inside together. I did not need to be told who these men represented. I had lived in that house long enough to recognize the particular tension that settled over the staff whenever someone connected to the old codes of loyalty and honor that governed the Voss family's world arrived unannounced. Margaret's warning echoed in my mind. I would prepare myself, if I were you, for whatever comes next. I sat at my window for the rest of that afternoon, watching the black car remain parked in the driveway, feeling for the first time since accepting Damien's proposal that I had wandered into a world with rules I did not understand and consequences I was entirely unprepared to face. Whatever those men had come to discuss, I understood without being told that it concerned me directly, and that whatever protection my engagement to Damien had once provided me was now, for the first time, no longer something I could count on. I thought about the ring on my finger, the one I had once believed made me untouchable in this house, a symbol of belonging to a family whose name commanded respect wherever it was spoken. Now it felt heavier than it ever had before, less like a promise and more like a warning I had failed to read in time. Somewhere behind those closed study doors, men who answered to codes older than any wedding vow were deciding what my carelessness would cost me, and all I could do was sit at my window and wait for an answer I was certain would not be kind. Damien summoned me to his study just after sunset, and the moment I stepped through the door, I knew this was not a conversation I could soften my way through. The 2 men in dark suits were gone, but their presence still seemed to linger in the room, in the stiffness of Damien's posture, in the careful way he chose his words as he asked me to sit down across from his desk. He did not sit himself. He stood by the window with his hands clasped behind him, the same position I had seen him in days earlier, except now there was no calm left in his expression at all. "Tell me what you found," he said quietly. I felt my stomach drop. "I do not know what you mean." "Margaret told me you asked her about Grace's family," he said, turning to face me fully. "And I know you have been in this study more than once this week, moving things you thought I would not notice were disturbed." There was no point in lying to him, not anymore. "I found the letters," I admitted, "from Harold Ashby. I know Grace is his daughter. I know what he did for your father." Damien closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing a blow he had been bracing for since the moment I asked Margaret those questions. When he opened them again, his gaze had hardened into something I had not seen directed at me before, not even in the days immediately following what I had done to Grace. "Those letters were private," he said, "written between my mother and a man who trusted our family enough to share his most guarded thoughts. You had no right to read them." "I know," I said, and I meant it. I was desperate to understand, Damien. Everyone around me suddenly treated me like a stranger, and you would tell me nothing. What was I supposed to do? Wait quietly while my entire life fell apart without explanation? "You were supposed to trust that I would handle it," he said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and brought it back under control. "You were supposed to understand that some matters require patience, Charlotte, not investigation conducted behind my back." "Patience while men in dark suits arrived to discuss my fate?" I asked, my own voice sharper than I intended. "Patience while the staff of this house looked at me like I had committed murder? You cannot ask me to remain calm and uninformed while my future is being decided by people I have never even met." Damien studied me for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, as though he recognized the fairness buried within my frustration, even as he remained angry about how I had gone about seeking answers. "Perhaps you are right," he admitted quietly. "Perhaps I should have told you more from the beginning, rather than assuming silence would protect you. But what is done, and now you know at least part of what you are dealing with." Something shifted in Damien's expression, a tightening around his eyes that told me I had crossed a line I would not be able to uncross. He walked slowly to his desk and sat down across from me, folding his hands together, studying me with an intensity that made me want to look away and refuse to at the same time. "Then you understand," he said, "that what you did to her was not simply an act of jealousy toward a maid." "I did not know who she was," I said, my voice small. "If I had known—" "If you had known, would it have mattered?" he interrupted, his voice sharper than I had ever heard it directed at me. "Would you have shown her kindness only because her father saved mine? Or should human decency not have required knowledge of her family history at all?" I had no answer for that, because he was right, and both of us knew it. My cruelty had not been justified by ignorance. It had simply been made worse by it. Damien rose from his chair and walked to the window again, staring out at the darkening grounds where his mother's roses stood in careful rows. "My father was 34 years old when the fire started," he said, his voice quieter now, almost distant. "A warehouse fire, started deliberately by men who wanted to destroy the shipment inside and send a message to our family. My father went in to save 2 workers trapped on the upper floor, and the roof came down before he could get them all out safely. I sat perfectly still, sensing that interrupting him now would be a mistake. Harold Ashby was a dock worker, nothing more. A man with no connection to our family, beyond the fact that he happened to be nearby when the fire broke out. He went in after my father without a moment's hesitation, pulled him out through a collapsing stairwell, and lost the full use of his right arm doing it. He never asked for anything in return. He never even told anyone what he had done until my father tracked him down months later and insisted on repaying a debt Harold considered already settled, simply by having done the right thing. Damien turned back to face me, his expression unreadable in the dim evening light. My father brought Harold and his family under our protection, from that day forward. When Harold died 2 years ago, I promised at his bedside that his daughter would never want for anything as long as I lived. I brought Grace into this house myself, not as an ordinary servant, but as someone I consider bound to this family by a debt that could never truly be repaid. Why did you never tell me any of this? I asked, my voice trembling. Because it was not mine to share carelessly, he said. Because some debts are sacred in ways that outsiders rarely understand, and because I hoped, foolishly perhaps, that you would come to see Grace's place in this household without needing the full weight of her history explained to you. I felt tears building behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in front of him. I thought she was your mistress, I admitted quietly. I thought you cared for her the way you were supposed to care only for me. Something almost like sadness passed across Damien's face. I care for her the way I would care for a sister I never had, he said. And in cutting her hair the way you did, in a house and a culture where such an act carries meaning, you clearly never bothered to learn. You did not simply humiliate a maid, Charlotte. You brought shame upon a family this house owes an unpayable debt to. What meaning? I asked. I do not understand what cutting her hair meant, beyond the obvious cruelty of it. Damien studied me for a long moment before answering. In the old traditions my grandmother still honored until her death, cutting a woman's hair against her will was a mark reserved for only the gravest offenses. A public declaration that she had been cast out, disgraced, stripped of honor in the eyes of her community. It is rarely practiced now, but the meaning has not been forgotten by those who still remember the old ways, and Harold Ashby's remaining family members are among those who remember most clearly. The full weight of what I had done finally settled over me completely. I had not simply acted out of petty jealousy toward a woman I mistakenly believed was a romantic rival. I had unknowingly enacted an ancient symbol of disgrace against the daughter of the man who had saved my fiancé's father's life. In a house built on decades of unspoken debt and honor, I had never once bothered to learn about. What happens now? I asked quietly. Damien was silent for a long moment before answering. Harold Ashby had 2 brothers before his death, men who still maintain connections to certain circles our family has long been careful to remain respectful toward. They have asked to speak with you directly, to understand your intentions and your remorse before deciding how this matter should be resolved. My blood went cold. What kind of circles, Damien? He met my eyes steadily. The kind that operate outside ordinary law, Charlotte. The kind my own family has always maintained careful, respectful distance from, because provoking them serves no one's interest. Harold's brothers are not men to be dismissed lightly, and the men who visited 2 days ago were their representatives, come to inform me that this matter will not be allowed to simply disappear. I could hardly breathe. Are they going to hurt me? I do not know, Damien said honestly, and something in his voice told me he was not simply saying this to frighten me further. What I do know is that my family's standing with them depends heavily on how this situation is handled, and that my own influence, considerable as it may be in most circumstances, holds far less weight when it comes to matters of honor within their world. Then help me, I said, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to remain composed. Damien, please, you must be able to do something. He studied me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something I had never expected to find there, a flicker of genuine conflict, as though he were weighing loyalties that pulled him in directions I could not fully understand. I will do what I can, he said finally. But you must understand, Charlotte, that some debts in this world are older and heavier than any promise I have made to you. I cannot simply erase what you have done, and I will not ask Harold's family to forgive something I am not certain deserves forgiveness. His words felt like a door closing slowly, inch by inch, on the life I had imagined for myself when I accepted his proposal all those months ago. When do they want to see me? I asked. Tomorrow evening, Damien said. They will come here, to this house, and you will answer for what you have done directly to them. I would advise you to think very carefully about what you say, and to show them a version of remorse that is genuine rather than convenient. I nodded, though inside, I felt as though the ground had opened beneath me, revealing a world far more dangerous and complicated than anything I had prepared myself for when I fell in love with a man whose family, I now understood, moved through shadows I had never even glimpsed until this week. Will Grace be there tomorrow? I asked, needing to know before I lost my courage to ask at all. Damien considered the question for a long moment. I do not know, he admitted. Her uncles may choose to bring her, or they may decide it is better she remain elsewhere while this is resolved. That decision is theirs to make, not mine. I would like the chance to apologize to her directly, I said. Whatever happens with her uncles, I owe her that much. Something flickered across Damien's face, an expression I could not quite name, somewhere between surprise and cautious approval. "That is the first thing you have said tonight that gives me any hope this can be resolved without lasting damage," he said. "Genuine remorse directed at Grace herself will matter more to her family than anything you say in your own defense." He walked me to the study door then, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder, in a gesture that felt more like reassurance than affection, as though he understood I needed some small comfort, even while he remained unwilling to fully forgive what I had done. "Get some rest if you can," he said. "Tomorrow will require more strength than you may realize you have." I left the study feeling both slightly steadied and more frightened than before, the weight of everything I had learned pressing down on me with a force I had not anticipated when I first knocked on that door demanding answers. Whatever Ezra and Daniel Ashby decided tomorrow evening would shape not only my future with Damien, but perhaps my safety itself. And no amount of preparation felt like enough, against a world I barely understood and had never asked to be part of. That night, I could not eat, could not sleep, could barely sit still long enough to gather my thoughts into anything resembling a coherent defense. I thought about Grace kneeling in that hallway, silent and unshaken, and wondered where she was now, whether she knew what was being decided on her behalf, whether she had asked for this reckoning, or whether it had been set in motion entirely by men, determined to protect their family's honor, regardless of what she herself wanted. I found myself, sometime past midnight, standing outside Margaret's small room near the kitchen, knocking softly until she opened the door in her robe, clearly startled to see me standing there. "Please," I said, "I need to understand what I am facing tomorrow. I need to know what these men are truly capable of." Margaret studied me for a long moment before stepping aside to let me in, closing the door quietly behind us. "Harold's brothers, Ezra and Daniel, are not violent men themselves," she said, sitting me down at her small table. "But they command the loyalty of people who are, and their word within certain circles carries weight that few outside this world can fully appreciate. They will not harm you without reason, Miss Hale, but they will demand an accounting, and how you answer that accounting will determine whether this matter ends quietly or becomes something far more serious." "What should I say to them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand, an act of kindness I had not expected from her after everything that had happened. "Tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them exactly why you did what you did, without excuses, without trying to soften your own cruelty. Men like Ezra and Daniel have spent their lives around liars and flatterers, Miss Hale. They will recognize honesty the moment they hear it, and it may be the only thing that saves you tomorrow evening. Have you met them before?" I asked. "Ezra and Daniel?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Many years ago, when Harold was still alive and would visit this house from time to see Mr. Voss's father, his brothers came with him occasionally. Ezra is the elder of the two, quiet and watchful, the kind of man who says little but misses nothing. Daniel speaks more freely, and I always found him easier to read, though I would not mistake his warmth for weakness. Both men loved their brother deeply, and both have grown fiercely protective of Grace since his passing, treating her as though she were their own daughter rather than a niece." "Do you think they will hurt me?" I asked again, needing to hear the answer, even though I suspected Margaret could not truly promise me anything. She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think they are men of honor first, and men capable of harsh action second," she said finally. "If they believed you acted with true malice, understanding fully who Grace was, and choosing cruelty regardless, I would fear greatly for what tomorrow might bring. But if they see genuine remorse, if they believe your ignorance was real rather than a convenient excuse, I believe there is a path forward that does not end in violence." Her words offered only thin comfort, but I clung to them anyway as I thanked her again and made my way back through the darkened house toward my room. The hallways felt longer that night, the shadows deeper, every creak of the old floorboards sounding like a footstep following behind me. I thought of Grace walking these same halls for the past year, carrying trays and folding towels, treated as ordinary staff by everyone except perhaps Damien, all while carrying a family history far heavier than anyone in that house had bothered to notice, myself included. I thanked her and returned to my room, but sleep never came. I lay awake through the remaining hours of darkness, rehearsing words I hoped would be enough, praying that whatever honesty I managed to offer these men would be received as genuine rather than desperate, understanding all the while that the choices I had made in a single moment of jealousy had set in motion consequences I could no longer control, no matter how much I now wished I could take back the scissors, the hallway, and the terrible mistake that had brought me to this point. The black car returned at exactly 7 the following evening, and this time I was the one waiting on the front steps to meet it. 2 men emerged, and I recognized them immediately as the same visitors from days earlier, though seeing them up close for the first time revealed details I had missed from my bedroom window. The elder of the two moved with a deliberate slowness that suggested old injury rather than age, his gray eyes taking in every detail of the house and my own trembling posture without a flicker of emotion crossing his weathered face. This, I understood immediately, was Ezra. The younger man beside him carried himself with an easier grace, his expression almost warm as he studied me, though something behind his eyes told me not to mistake that warmth for softness. Daniel, exactly as Margaret had described him. "Miss Hale," Ezra said, his voice quiet, but carrying an authority that made my chest tighten. "I understand you have something you wish to say to us." "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." I had spent the entire day preparing for this moment, rehearsing words in front of my mirror until they felt hollow from repetition, discarding one version of an apology after another because each one sounded either too rehearsed or too desperate. In the end, I decided the only thing I could offer these men was the plain, unpolished truth, delivered without the polish I might have used to charm my way through an ordinary social difficulty. This was not a situation charm could resolve. Damien appeared behind me on the steps, and the 3 men exchanged a brief nod before he led us all inside to the formal sitting room, a space I had rarely used since moving into the house, its high windows and dark furniture giving the entire scene a solemnity that matched the gravity of what was about to unfold. Margaret brought tea that no one touched, then quietly withdrew, closing the door behind her. I sat across from Ezra and Daniel, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking, while Damien took a position slightly behind me, close enough to offer support, but far enough to make clear this conversation belonged to me alone. "Tell us why you did it," Ezra said, without preamble. "Not the version you have rehearsed, to make yourself sound sympathetic. The truth." I took a breath, remembering Margaret's advice from the night before, and forced myself to speak honestly, rather than reaching for the excuses that had felt so convincing just days earlier. "I was jealous," I said. "I saw the way Damien treated Grace, the warmth in his voice, the attention he paid her, and I convinced myself it meant something it did not. I did not ask questions. I did not seek to understand who she was, or why Damien cared for her the way he did. I simply acted out of insecurity and hurt her because I believed, wrongly, that she posed a threat to my place in this house." "And now?" Daniel asked, leaning forward slightly. "Now that you understand who she is, what she and her family mean to the Voss name, how do you feel about what you did?" "Ashamed," I said, and the word came out rougher than I intended, thick with an emotion I had been holding back for days. I did not know Grace's father saved Damien's father's life. I did not know cutting her hair carried meaning beyond simple cruelty, though I understand now that ignorance does not excuse what I did. I hurt a woman who had done nothing to deserve it, based on assumptions I never bothered to question, and I understand if that is unforgivable to you both. Ezra studied me in silence for what felt like an unbearably long time, his gray eyes giving away nothing of what he was thinking. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "My brother spent the last years of his life with limited use of his right arm, because he chose, without hesitation, to run into a burning building for a man he barely knew. He never once complained about that sacrifice. He never once asked for anything beyond what Damien's father offered freely out of gratitude. Do you understand what that kind of loyalty means, Miss Hale? Do you understand what it means to a family like ours when someone treats a piece of that loyalty as though it were disposable?" "I am beginning to," I said quietly. "I do not think I can fully understand it, not the way you do, having lived it. But I understand enough to know that what I did was wrong regardless of what I knew or did not know about Grace's history." Daniel exchanged a glance with his brother before speaking again. "Grace has not asked for revenge," he said. "When we told her what we intended to discuss with you and Damien, She asked only that whatever happened, it not become something that shames the Voss family publicly. She has always cared more about protecting this family's name than protecting her own dignity. A trait, I confess, worries me more than it should. Something in his words struck me deeply. Even after everything I had done to her, Grace's first concern remained the family that had taken her in after her father's death, rather than any desire to see me punished for my cruelty. The contrast between her selflessness and my own jealous, thoughtless actions made my shame burn even hotter. "Where is she now?" I asked. "Is she safe? Is she well?" "She is staying with us," Ezra said, "recovering, in her own way, from an insult that cut deeper than the hair you took from her. She does not know we are here tonight, discussing her situation, and we intend to keep it that way until we have decided how this matter should be resolved." "I would like to see her," I said, "to apologize directly, if she is willing to hear it." Ezra's expression remained unreadable, but Daniel studied me with something that looked almost like curiosity. "That is not a small request," he said. "Grace has every right to refuse to see you at all, and if she does refuse, you will need to accept that decision without argument or further attempt at contact." "I understand," I said. "I only want the chance to offer what I should have offered before I ever touched those scissors. Whether she accepts my apology is entirely her choice." The brothers exchanged another long look, some silent communication passing between them, built from decades of shared history I could not begin to interpret. Finally, Ezra turned back to me. "We will consider your request," he said. "In the meantime, understand this clearly, Miss Hale. Damien's family owes ours a debt that will never fully be repaid, and we have always respected the Voss name enough to handle matters privately, rather than through methods that would embarrass either family publicly. That respect, however, has limits. If we come to believe your remorse tonight was performance, rather than genuine feeling, or if any harm comes to Grace in the future through your actions or influence, that respect will not protect you." "It will not need to," I said, meeting his gaze directly despite every instinct urging me to look away. "I will not go near Grace again unless she herself wishes it. I will not act out of jealousy or fear again, without first understanding the full truth of a situation. I have learned that lesson at a cost I will carry with me for the rest of my life." Daniel studied me for a long moment, before finally allowing something close to a small, tired smile to cross his face. "For what it is worth," he said, "I believe you mean that, at least tonight, in this room. Whether you continue to mean it once the fear of this conversation fades, is something only time will reveal." "May I ask you something?" I said, surprising myself with the sudden boldness of the question. Ezra tilted his head slightly, waiting. "Why did Harold never tell anyone what he had done, until Damien's father found him?" I asked. "If I had done something so selfless, I think I would have wanted the world to know." For the first time that evening, something almost like warmth crossed Ezra's weathered face, though it faded quickly. "Because my brother did not believe kindness required an audience to matter," he said. "He ran into that fire because it was the right thing to do, not because he hoped for gratitude or reward afterward. It took Damien's father months to even learn Harold's name, and when he finally tracked him down to offer thanks, Harold nearly refused the offer entirely, believing he had done nothing more than any decent man would have done in his place." "Grace carries that same quality," Daniel added quietly. "She has never once, in the 2 years since her father's passing, asked this family for anything beyond what was already freely given. She works in that house, not because she needs the wages, but because she believes idle hands dishonor the sacrifice her father made. It is part of why what you did wounded her so deeply, Miss Hale. Not merely the physical act itself, but the fact that it came from someone who never once tried to understand who she truly was before judging her." His words landed harder than any threat could have. I had spent months living alongside Grace, sharing meals under the same roof, passing her in hallways nearly every day, and I had never once asked her a single question about her own life, her own history, her own reasons for being there. I had built an entire narrative of jealousy and suspicion around her, without ever bothering to see her as a full person, deserving of basic curiosity, let alone kindness. I did not deserve to share a home with someone like that, without recognizing what she was, I said quietly, more to myself than to the men across from me. Damien stepped forward then, speaking for the first time since the conversation began. "I will personally ensure Charlotte upholds whatever conditions you set," he said. "My family's word stands behind hers now, for better or worse, and I will not allow that word to be broken." Ezra rose slowly from his seat, his old injury clearly making the movement more effortful than it once might have been. "We will speak with Grace," he said. "Her wishes will guide whatever happens next. More than anything, either of you say tonight. If she chooses never to see you again, Miss Hale, you will honor that choice completely and without complaint. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said, "completely." The brothers left shortly after, Damien walking them out to their car, while I remained alone in the sitting room, the weight of everything that had just happened finally settling over me in full. I had not been harmed tonight, at least not physically, but I understood now with painful clarity how close I had come to losing far more than I had ever realized was at stake, and how entirely the next chapter of my life now depended on the forgiveness, or lack of it, of a young woman I had wronged out of nothing more than my own insecurity. When Damien returned, he sat beside me quietly for a long moment before speaking. "You did well tonight," he said. "Better than I expected, if I am honest." "Do you think Grace will agree to see me?" I asked. He considered the question carefully. "I do not know," he admitted. "But I know Grace better than most, and I know she has never been a woman who holds on to anger easily, even when she has every right to. Whether that means she will forgive you, or simply that she will find peace without needing to see you again, I cannot say." "I keep thinking about something Daniel said," I told Damien, breaking the long silence between us. "That Grace never asked for anything, that she works in your house because idle hands would dishonor her father's memory. I never once considered that she might have her own reasons for staying, her own sense of purpose, separate from anything you or your family offered her." "Grace has always been stronger than people give her credit for," Damien said. "I think that is part of why I never worried when she was near, why I never imagined you would see threat in someone who has only ever wanted to earn her place honestly, rather than have it handed to her." "I wish I had seen that in her from the beginning," I said, "instead of seeing a rival." Damien was quiet for a long moment. "You are not the first person to misjudge someone out of fear rather than malice," he said finally. "That does not excuse what happened, but it does mean there may still be a path forward, if Grace is willing to walk it with you." We remained in that room long after the tea had gone cold, neither of us reaching to refill it, both of us simply sitting with the uncertainty of what tomorrow might bring. I thought about the letters I had found, about Harold Ashby's quiet, selfless courage, about a daughter who had inherited that same quiet strength, and now held the power to decide whether my future with Damien would continue or end entirely because of a single afternoon of jealousy I could never undo. Eventually, Damien walked me to my room, pausing at the door before leaving me for the night. "Whatever Grace decides," he said, "know that I do not regret choosing you 18 months ago. I only regret that it took something this painful to reveal how much you still had left to learn about the world you were marrying into." His words offered small comfort, but I clung to them anyway as I closed my door and sat alone in the darkness, waiting for morning, and whatever answer it might finally bring. The call came just after 9 the next morning, and Damien's face told me everything before he even repeated the words into the phone. "They have agreed," he said, hanging up and turning to face me across the breakfast table. "Grace has agreed to see you, this afternoon, at Ezra's house." My hands trembled around my cup of tea. I had spent the entire night preparing myself for either outcome, forgiveness or refusal, but hearing the actual words still left me unsteady in a way I had not expected. "Did she say why?" I asked. "Why she agreed?" "Ezra did not share her reasons," Damien said. "Only that she wishes to speak with you alone, without myself or her uncles present in the room." The thought of facing Grace without Damien beside me sent a fresh wave of fear through my chest, but I understood immediately why she would want it this way. Whatever needed to be said between us belonged only to the two of us, not filtered through the presence of the man who connected our lives together in ways neither of us had chosen. Ezra's house sat at the edge of town, a modest but well-kept building, surrounded by a garden far less grand than the roses at Damien's estate, but tended with the same evident care. Daniel met me at the door, his expression unreadable as he led me through a small, comfortable sitting room and out to a back porch where Grace sat alone, looking out over a yard bordered by tall wooden fencing. Her hair had grown slightly since the last time I had seen her, still shorter than it once was, uneven in places where the damage from that terrible afternoon had not yet fully softened. She turned as I approached, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, the weight of everything unsaid stretching between us like something physical. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," I said finally, my voice smaller than I intended. Grace studied me with the same calm, steady eyes I remembered from that hallway, the eyes that had haunted my thoughts every night since. "Sit down, Charlotte," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I think we both have things that need saying." I sat, my hands folded tightly in my lap, waiting for her to speak first, understanding that whatever came next belonged entirely to her to shape. "I have had a lot of time to think, these past days," Grace said, "about why you did what you did, about what it must have felt like to watch Damien care for someone you did not understand, in a house full of secrets no one bothered to explain to you." She paused, looking out over the yard for a long moment before continuing. "That does not make it right. But I understand it more than perhaps my uncles wish I did." "I have no excuse," I said. "I want you to know that clearly. What I did to you was cruel, and it came from jealousy I never bothered to question before acting on it. I am ashamed of the woman I was that afternoon." Grace nodded slowly, absorbing my words without immediate response. "My father used to tell me that anger, born from fear, is the most dangerous kind, because it convinces itself it is justice," she said. "I think that is what happened to you. You were afraid of losing Damien, afraid of not being enough for a family this powerful, and that fear twisted itself into something that looked like righteous anger, at least to you, in that moment. That still does not excuse hurting you," I said. "No," she agreed. "It does not, but it helps me understand you were not simply cruel by nature, Charlotte. You were frightened, and frightened people sometimes do terrible things to people who never deserved them. Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man," I said quietly. "He was," Grace said, and for the first time since I arrived, her composed expression softened into something more vulnerable. "He never spoke much about the fire, even when I asked him directly as a child. He always said the real story was not about the fire at all, but about what a person chooses to do with the years they are given afterward. He spent the rest of his life working the docks despite his injury, never once accepting charity beyond what Damien's father insisted on providing, always determined to earn his own way, even after losing so much. He raised a daughter who clearly inherited that same determination," I said. Grace allowed a small, tired smile. "I try. Some days more successfully than others." She looked down at her hands for a moment, before continuing. "When you cut my hair, Charlotte, I will admit something to you now that I have not admitted to my uncles, or even to Damien. In that moment, kneeling on that floor, I thought of my father, and how he never once let anger determine his choices, even after losing the use of his arm for a man he barely knew. I told myself, if he could face that kind of loss without bitterness, I could face this smaller cruelty the same way." Her words humbled me in a way I had not expected. "You showed more strength in that hallway than I have shown in my entire life," I admitted. "Perhaps," Grace said, "or perhaps I simply had a better example to follow than you did, growing up. Strength is not something we invent alone, Charlotte. It is something we learn from the people who raise us, and from the mistakes we are forced to reckon with afterward." We sat in silence for a while after that, the afternoon breeze moving gently through the yard, birds calling somewhere beyond the fence line. I found myself studying her more closely than I ever had during the months we had shared a home together, noticing details I had never bothered to see before, the quiet strength in her posture, the steadiness in her hands as she finally reached for the cup of tea beside her. "Can I ask you something?" I said finally. Grace nodded. "Why did you never tell me who you truly were? Why let me believe you were simply staff, all those months, when the truth might have changed everything between us?" Something like sadness passed briefly across her face. "Because I have spent my whole life being defined by what my father did," she said. "The girl whose father saved the Voss family, the daughter Damien feels obligated to protect. I wanted, just once, to be known simply as Grace, without that history attached to every conversation. I suppose I hoped, foolishly, that if I never mentioned it, People might eventually see me as nothing more than a woman working hard in an unfamiliar house, rather than a debt someone else was quietly repaying. Her words struck something deep in me, a recognition of my own quiet insecurities mirrored back through a completely different lens. I had spent months worrying about being enough for Damien's world, while Grace had spent years worrying about being seen as more than a walking reminder of a debt she never asked her family to be owed. "I am sorry," I said again, meaning it more fully than I had at any point since that terrible afternoon. Not just for what I did with the scissors, but for never once asking who you truly were before deciding what you meant to me. Grace studied me for a long moment, something shifting behind her steady eyes. "My uncles wanted to make an example of you," she said finally. "To ensure the Voss family understood the seriousness of what happened, to protect what remains of my father's legacy in the only way men like them know how to protect anything, through consequence and fear." My stomach tightened. "And you disagreed?" I told them, "Consequence built on fear rarely changes a person's heart," Grace said. "It only teaches them to hide their cruelty better next time. I asked them instead to let me decide what happens between us, because I believe understanding does more lasting good than punishment ever could." "What have you decided?" I asked, hardly able to breathe as I waited for her answer. Grace rose from her chair and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the yard for a long moment before turning back to face me. "I will return to Damien's house," she said, "not as an act of forgiveness alone, but because I still believe in the purpose my father's sacrifice gave my life there. I will not pretend the wound you caused has fully healed, Charlotte, because it has not, and perhaps it never fully will. But I am willing to try building something different between us, if you are willing to actually see me this time, rather than the fear you built me into." Relief and shame washed over me in equal measure, tears finally breaking free after days of holding them back through sheer stubborn pride. "Thank you," I said. "I promise you, I will not make the same mistake twice. I will ask the questions I should have asked from the very beginning." "I will hold you to that," Grace said, something almost like a small, tired smile crossing her face for the first time since I had arrived. "Not because I doubt your sincerity today, but because sincerity in a single afternoon means little without consistency over the months that follow." We talked for a while longer after that, slowly, carefully, building the first fragile foundation of something that might one day resemble genuine understanding between us, though neither of us pretended it would happen quickly or easily. When I finally rose to leave, Grace walked me to the gate at the edge of Ezra's small garden, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the grass between us. "For what it is worth," she said as I stepped through the gate, "I do not think Damien ever loved anyone the way he cares for you, Charlotte. Whatever fear drove you to hurt me, it was born from something real between you and him. Do not let this mistake convince you that you were never worthy of his affection in the first place." Her words followed me the entire drive back to the Voss estate, settling something in my chest that had been unsettled since the moment I first heard whispers about late-night conversations in a study I did not yet understand. I had built my worst fears into cruelty, and Grace, despite everything I had taken from her, had chosen to meet that cruelty with patience rather than revenge, understanding rather than judgment. Damien met me at the door when I returned, searching my face for answers before I even spoke a word. "She is coming back," I told him. "Not because she has forgiven me completely, but because she is willing to give both of us the chance to become better than the people we were this past week." Something in Damien's shoulders visibly relaxed, a tension I had not fully realized he was carrying finally easing. "That is more than I hoped for," he admitted quietly. "More than either of us likely deserved, given the circumstances." Grace returned to the house 3 days later, her belongings once again settled into the small room at the back of the estate, her presence moving through the hallways with the same quiet steadiness I remembered from before everything changed between us. I made a point, that first week, of learning things about her I had never bothered to ask before, small details about her favorite books, her opinions on the garden Damien's mother had once tended, the quiet dreams she held for her own future beyond the walls of that house. It was not an easy friendship to build, not at first. There were awkward silences between us, moments where old wounds surfaced unexpectedly in conversation, careful boundaries neither of us wanted to cross too quickly. One evening, only a week after her return, I found Grace standing quietly in front of the mirror in her small room, touching the uneven ends of her hair, with an expression of quiet sadness she quickly tried to hide when she noticed me in the doorway. "I did not mean to intrude," I said, ready to leave her to her privacy. "You are not intruding," she said, though her voice carried a rawness I had not heard from her since our conversation on Ezra's porch. "I suppose old wounds surface at unexpected moments. It will grow back fully in time. I know that. It simply takes longer to feel like myself again than I expected." I stepped further into the room, uncertain whether I had the right to offer comfort after everything I had taken from her. "Would it help if I sat with you a while?" I asked. "Not to talk, if you would rather not. Just so you are not alone with it." Grace studied me for a long moment before nodding, and we sat together on the edge of her narrow bed in silence, the last light of evening fading slowly through her small window. It was not a grand gesture, nor did it undo what I had done, but something small shifted between us that evening, a fragile thread of trust beginning to form where only fear and misunderstanding had existed before. Over the following weeks, small moments like that one began to accumulate. I learned that Grace loved old poetry, the kind her mother used to read aloud before her passing, and that she kept a single worn book of verses tucked beneath her pillow, its pages soft from years of handling. I learned that she still visited her father's grave every month, walking the distance herself rather than accepting a ride, because she said the walk gave her time to remember him properly rather than rushing through grief. I learned that she dreamed, quietly and without much hope of it ever happening, of one day training as a nurse, a profession she had always admired but never believed herself capable of affording. When I mentioned this last detail to Damien one evening, he grew thoughtful, and within a month, arrangements had been made, quietly and without fanfare, for Grace to begin evening classes at a nursing program in town, her household duties adjusted to accommodate the new schedule. She thanked him formally, the way she always did, but I noticed something different in her eyes that week, a flicker of hope I had not seen from her since her father's passing. But slowly, over the weeks that followed, something genuine began to grow in place of the jealousy and misunderstanding that had once defined our entire relationship. On the morning of my wedding, months later, I found Grace waiting outside my dressing room, her hair grown back nearly to its original length, framing a face that had softened considerably since that afternoon in Ezra's garden. "I wanted to give you something," she said, holding out a small, carefully wrapped box. Inside was a simple silver hairpin, delicate and old-fashioned, clearly an heirloom rather than something purchased recently. "It belonged to my mother," Grace explained. "She passed when I was young, before my father's accident, before any of this history between our families began. I want you to wear it today, as a reminder that new beginnings are possible, even after the deepest wounds." I held the pin carefully in my palm, understanding fully the weight of what she was offering me, a piece of her own history, entrusted to the woman who had once tried to erase a piece of hers, out of nothing more than fear and jealousy. "I will treasure this," I told her, my voice thick with emotion I no longer bothered to hide. "I know you will," Grace said simply. "You have become someone very different from the woman who once stood over me with those scissors, Charlotte. I am glad I chose patience instead of revenge that day in my uncle's garden." As I walked down the aisle later that afternoon, the silver pin holding my hair in place, I caught Grace's eyes among the gathered guests, her steady gaze meeting mine with something that finally, fully, resembled genuine warmth. Whatever mistakes had brought us to this moment, whatever cruelty I had once shown a woman I never bothered to understand, something stronger had grown in its place, built not on debt or obligation, but on the simple, hard-won understanding that people are rarely who our fears convince us they are, and that the truest strength often lies not in punishment, but in the quiet, deliberate choice to forgive. I thought, in that moment, of the scissors I had once held with such careless certainty, and of how far I had traveled from the woman who wielded them without a second thought. Grace had given me more than her forgiveness that year. She had given me the chance to become someone worthy of the family I was joining, and worthy, finally, of the friendship she had chosen to offer a woman who had once tried to take everything from her.